are nearing the very end of our Genesis study. For now, we will pick this up in a future date. We've got chapter 24 and 25 to finish. I'll take some time to go through the book of Galatians, and when that's completed, we'll likely come back to Genesis and pick up where we've left off. So, in our study of Abraham and Sarah that originally began all the way back in chapter 11, many, many weeks ago, and it was contained for us within the genealogical information of Terah, who happened to be the father of Abraham and the father of Sarah from a different mother. Abraham and Sarah would eventually marry and establish their own family here in chapter 23, and then in chapter 25, we will see both the death of Sarah here and then the death of Abraham. And with the death of Abraham and Sarah, it will bring to an end an incredibly significant era of not only Bible history, but of this period of the patriarchs. The sons that would come from Abraham's line will carry on the patriarchal impact through Isaac, his children, Jacob and his children, and so on down the line it goes. We're going to cover the entirety of this chapter today, so rather than looking at it in large sections, we're going to kind of walk through it a little bit more slowly, reading what is applicable to the notes that you have in your sermon guide in front of you. So today we focus on the death of Sarah. And from chapter 23, verse 1, we read this. Now Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So this single verse kind of gives us an introduction of, letter A, her life. We don't have all the details of her birth, her upbringing. We don't have a ton of detail about the lives that she and Abraham lived together as a married couple. But at Sarah's death, based upon what is revealed to us throughout the scripture, we can calculate that Abraham and Sarah had been married over 100 years. Think about that. We would say, well, to live 100 years, that's a really, really long life. But imagine being married for 100 years to the same person. It's quite a challenge, right? But this is the legacy of the life of Sarah, that she was married to Abraham for 100 years. We also know that it has been 62 years since Abraham and Sarah left the area of Ur of the Chaldeans and made their way to Canaan and have sojourned through this land. So Sarah had been Abraham's partner on this epic journey from Ur all throughout the region of Canaan and beyond, and then down to Egypt and back again as they moved around in the promised land and the outskirts of that in the southern country. So Sarah had been present for every milestone in Abraham's life. Every time that God would appear to Abraham, while Sarah was not necessarily sitting right next to Abraham, she very certainly heard about all the different things that God had told him. When God would appear to Abraham in a theophany, Sarah would hear what it was that God had said and what it was he had done. When Abraham went out and had the unexpected defeat of the invading eastern kings, the coalition, Abraham was victorious in taking care of that coalition that had attacked the Sodomite cities. And as he came back from that victory, meeting the high priest Melchizedek, and Sarah certainly heard about all of that. She heard about the covenant of circumcision, the dramatic renaming of Abram to Abraham and of Sarai to Sarah, Abraham's intercession for the destruction of Sodom, and then, of course, when Abraham took Isaac up to the mountains of Moriah to sacrifice him, Sarah most certainly knew of that as well. So Sarah was there through every milestone of Abraham's life, but she was also there for Abraham's failure, some of which she had a direct involvement in, twice agreeing to perpetuate the deception that she was not his wife, but instead his sister. And this would lead to 2 abductions, one by Pharaoh and another by King Abimelech. And of course, she was responsible for her own failures by suggesting that Abraham father a child through her maidservant Hagar, giving birth to the rival Ishmael, and all the drama that was brought into the family because of that. And then when she heard with her very own ears the promise of the coming son Isaac, she laughed and she mocked the declaration, exposing her flaws and her immature faith. So much like Abraham, she was flawed, but was a faithful partner in this life of faith that included her in the hall of faith as recorded in the 11th chapter of Hebrews. We would read in Hebrews 11:11, by faith even Sarah herself received ability to conceive even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. So at the initial announcement of her giving birth, she mocked and she laughed, but according to the writer of Hebrews, it was her faith in what she heard that enabled her to eventually conceive this child of promise. And so she became a very faithful partner for Abraham through 100 years of marriage, and especially in the 60-some years of this journey from Ur into the Promised Land. So now we read that her life has come to an end, and verse 2 says, Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Sarah's death in Hebron is right in the middle of the land of promise. We don't know how long Abraham mourned for her. We don't have any detail from that. But this faithful companion who lived a long life has now passed. And after this time of mourning, it is now time to make preparation for her burial. What is interesting to think about is that Sarah is the first in many coming generations who will die in the promised land without inheriting the fullness of the promise that was made to the descendants of Abraham, that would be made to future Israel. And so she is the first of many who would eventually die in this land of promise without actually inheriting all that God had promised to them. The writer of Hebrews lists the great saints of old and summarizes their lives this way. So Abraham and Sarah and the patriarchs and many who came after that would all have the same thing said about them. Hebrews 11:13, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on earth. So it's quite difficult to think about dying in a land that is not your own, a land that you don't belong to, but this was the life for the patriarch. They were simply passing through, waiting for the fullness of God's promise to be realized. Many of them would never see that. In fact, the actual inhabiting of the Promised Land would not come until 430 years after Egypt was taken into Israel was taken into slavery by Egypt and led out through the leadership of Moses. So with Sarah's death, Abraham needs to make burial arrangements, and this leads us into letter B, her burial. Verses 3 and 4. Then Abraham rose from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner among you. Give me a burial site among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. So the first thing that we see here is the very simple request that Abraham makes. We're told that the sons of Heth here are the ones that Abraham is speaking to, and these are also known as the Hittites. We are first introduced into the Hittites in the Table of Nations. All the way back in chapter 10, we are told that they are the inhabitants of Canaan in chapter 15. And so Abraham was living in Beersheba after he made a treaty with King Abimelech to live and to have access to the well and to the pasture land there. And so he doesn't want to bury Sarah where he will see her. And so he goes to the Hittites and asks for a place where Sarah can be buried out of his immediate sight. And so he approaches them. Abraham's request for a burial site is more than just a place for Sarah to be buried. It is as much as him speaking prophetically of his belief about his offspring one day inhabiting the land that his faithful wife Sarah is going to be buried in. So the legal purchase of land was a full investment of a promise against the present circumstance. They were simply sojourners in a land not their own, and Abraham is going to buy land prophetically, claiming the future inheritance that is going to come to his descendants, the future nation of Israel. Sarah's body, entombed in Hebron, which is the center of Canaan, was his public stake in God's promise against all present appearance. He doesn't have any rightful claim to this land, only what God has promised. He doesn't have any legal ownership of it, only what God has promised. So against the present circumstance, Abraham is making a public stake by seeking to purchase a place where he can bury his wife Sarah. Again, the writer of Hebrews speaks to this entire arrangement in chapter 11, verses 9 and 10. By faith, he, Abraham, lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise, for he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So this very first burial site will go a long way in establishing confidence of a complete future ownership. It isn't obvious to us in reading this, but as you go through the book of Genesis and then the rest of Israel's history, we can look back and see what is actually taking place through the life of Abraham as a patriarch living in a land not his own, but by faith claiming that one day his ancestors are going to inherit this land. So secondly, we're going to see in our outline here is not only this burial request, but also a negotiation for the land itself. Verses 5 and 6. The sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, Hear us, my Lord, you are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our graves. None of us will refuse you his grave for burying your dead. So the response to Abraham's request is met with a sign of respect. You are a mighty prince among us. Now the word in the Hebrew for mighty is the same word Elohim, which is a title for God, a name of God, and it conveys the idea that the Hittites believe that Abraham is more than just an ordinary man. Perhaps he is a prince of God, or at the very least, someone that God is choosing to work through. So as you remember with King Abimelech, Abraham's notoriety is very well known within the land. And so it seems like on the surface that there is a sign of respect being given to Abraham here. So they greet him respectfully, but in reality, more is going on here than is obvious in a casual reading, and we're going to see that as we go through this. So Abraham is making a request that he has no guarantee will be granted him. So the Hittites are not obligated to do anything for Abraham, but they would likely think it would not hurt them to gain favor in his eyes, because if there's no real risk to them, then entering into some kind of a generous arrangement with Abraham could only benefit them down the road. Remembering that Abraham is a very, very wealthy man, has lots of livestock, probably has some inroads with some of the neighboring tribes and clans around him. We don't have a ton of detail in this immediate time frame, but we go on and read verses 7 through 9 here and learn a little bit more about what's going on here. Verse 7, So Abraham rose and bowed to the people of the land, the sons of Heth, and he spoke with them, saying, If it is your wish for me to bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and approach Ephron the son of Zohar for me, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns, which is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence for a burial site. So there is this general request, there is this general agreement, and now there is the specific of what it is Abraham is asking for, and he's still speaking to the general group that is assembled there. So you'll notice very, very quietly in this verse, in verse 7, Abraham is seated, and he stands to bow again as a sign of respect to them. And the reality is that when he is seated and then stands to bow before them in a sign of respect, it indicates that Abraham is likely, or in fact Abraham is, at the city gate where all of the official business is conducted. And this is done in the hearing of the entirety of the of the people who make things happen, the council, if you will. And so Abraham's conversation here is not a private conversation with a very, very small group of people. It is a very public conversation at the city gate where legal proceedings and legal transactions would take place. So Abraham identifies exactly what he wants. He wants the cave at Machpelah, which is owned by Ephraim of Zohar. So Abraham indicates that he's willing to pay full price for the cave. He's not looking for a handout or a gift. He knows where he wants to bury his wife. He knows who owns the cave, and he's indicated that he's willing to buy that. He has not spoken to Ephraim of Zohar directly. He's speaking to the council or the group that is there, but now Ephraim is going to speak directly to him and answer Abraham's request. Verse 10 and 11. Now Ephraim was sitting among the sons of Heth, gathered with the Hittites at the city gate. And Ephraim the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the sons of Heth, even of all who went in at the gate of the city, saying, "No, my Lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the presence of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead." So when we read through this very casually, it appears that Ephraim of Zohar is making a very generous offer to Abraham. Not only am I going to give you the cave, but I am going to give you the field that the cave actually sits upon. So by adding the field to the cave, there is significantly more value to this potential transaction. So while on the surface it sounds like Ephraim of Zohar is really going out of his way in a sign of respect to Abraham and giving him far more than he really asked for, he's really upping the stakes and upping the ante of what it is he expects from Abraham in return for his willingness to allow him to bury his dead here. He makes this offer in the presence of the people gathered at the city gate. In fact, those who are passing through the city gate can hear this transaction actually taking place, which confirms that it isn't a private transaction, but a legally binding public one, just as legal proceedings would take place in the ancient culture. But there's a problem that is not very obvious to us since we don't understand the ancient world in the way scholars do. In the ancient world, with transactions like this, legally binding the transfer of ownership of land, if it is a gift or if it is a reduced payment purchase, later down the road, the seller could rescind the offer and take it back. Well, that'd be a big problem, wouldn't it? Could you imagine shelling out all kinds of money or inheriting this thing as a gift from someone, and then 10 years down the road they said, I changed my mind, I need that, I'm taking it back. So this is what would commonly take place in the ancient world when this transaction would take place as a gift or as a reduced payment. The seller actually had the ability to rescind the offer and take it back. That would mean that if Abraham accepted the cave and the field as a gift, he would potentially risk losing it somewhere down the road. It's very likely that Abraham knew this and therefore would be willing to pay the price in order to acquire this land for the burial of his wife Sarah and not risk losing that somewhere down the road. So with Abraham's understanding of the shrewdness of what is being said by Ephraim of Zohar, we read his response in verse 12 and 13. And Abraham bowed before the people of the land, again showing this sign of respect, and he spoke to Ephraim in the hearing of the people of the land, saying, "If you will only please listen to me, I will give the price of the field, accept it from me, that I may bury my dead there." So it's clear that Abraham is not looking for a gift. He's willing to pay for the field although that is not what he initially asked for and doesn't necessarily need the field. He just really wants and needs the cave. He isn't going to quibble over the cave and trying to separate it out from the field, but in order to get the cave, he knows he's going to have to pay for the field as well. So Ephron responds to this, verse 14 and 15. Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, "My Lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver, what is that between me and you? So bury your dead." Well, again, on the surface, it sounds that like Ephron's response, he's just willing to give to Abraham the land and the cave, because after all, it's only 400 shekels of silver. What's that between us? Aren't we lifelong friends? Aren't we buddies? Aren't we partners? Can't you trust me to give this to you? All of that is implied. It's between the lines. And what Ephron is really saying is that if you want the cave, you're going to have to buy the field, and the price for that is going to be 400 shekels of silver. This is a very common way that transactions would be verbalized in the ancient culture. It was also very common in the ancient culture for negotiating the purchase price for things like land to be very much frowned upon, and haggling or trying to secure a better deal would not be received very well, and it could actually cause the deal to be undone. If Abraham tried to get it for less, Ephron might be very willing to say, "Well, I think I'm going to keep it. You just have to go find someplace else to bury your dead." So all of that is between the lines, not obvious in the casual reading, but this is what Abraham knows, and this is how Ephron conducts business. And so this is what's been laid out. If you want the cave, you're going to have to buy the field, and the price for that is 400 shekels of silver. So what is also not known to us is this. A shekel of silver, in our more common understanding, is very simply a coin. But coinage did not develop for hundreds of years later. And so a shekel of silver was a measurement of weight, not a number of coins. And so what we've been told is that 400 shekels of silver would be approximately 6¼ pounds of silver. Not 30 pieces of silver, as Jesus was sold for by Judas in the temple. Not 400 pieces of silver, but 6¼ pounds of silver, which would be the equivalent of the weight of 400 shekels. Now, those that know the era and know the land transaction practices of this time frame pretty much agree that this is an exorbitant price. It's Ephron taking advantage of Abraham's need and desire, but Abraham didn't really have any choice. And after all, he was a wealthy man, and he had the ability to pay the price that was being asked of him. So while Ephron may have expected a counter-proposal, he didn't get it. Verses 16 through 18. Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver which he had named, in the hearing of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, commercial standard. So Ephron's field, which was in Machpelah, which faced Mamre, the field and cave which was in it, and all the trees which were in the field that were within all the confines of its border were deeded over to Abraham for possession in the presence of the sons of Heth before all who went in at the gate of this city. Now, what Moses is going to great pains to state here is that all of this took place as a part of the normal legal proceedings of the day. It is a legally binding transaction. And as future Israel, who is with Moses in this wilderness wandering period, would eventually enter into the promised land, they would understand that not only is this land theirs because God gave it to them, but it's also, this section is theirs because Abraham bought it for 400 shekels of silver. So Abraham pays the stated amount and got exactly what he wanted. There's three things that stand out here that aren't quite so obvious in our casual reading. Number one, the deal was transacted in the city gate in full public view and in full disclosure. What that means is, nowhere down the line could Ephraim of Zohar say, that is not what I said, that is not what we agreed upon, this was not what we had done. Secondly, the agreement was struck in the hearing of all the Hittites who watched as the 6+ pounds of silver were measured out in strict conformity to the practices that were common in the business world of that day, which is why Moses writes here, 400 shekels of silver, commercial standard, indicating that this is how business was transacted in that day. Thirdly, the price was exactly what Ephraim requested, so that Abraham's ownership could never be disputed in the future. All of this took place above board in the hearing of the Hittites at the city gate, exactly what Ephraim wanted. Abraham was willing to pay that out. So thirdly, number 3 in our outline here, a burial is now completed, verse 19 and 20. So after this, Abraham buried his wife in the cave of the field at Machpelah, facing Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave that is in it were deeded over to Abraham for a burial site by the sons of Heth. So while this seems kind of innocuous to us, this really doesn't sound very significant, don't really understand why this is very important. This is all preparatory groundwork through the patriarch Abraham, who is the first in the fathers of future Israel. And this area that Abraham has now purchased is going to have significant meaning throughout all of Israel's history, most especially through the lives of the patriarchs. So the end result is that Abraham had a burial site for Sarah, and he had a large burial plot for his descendants. So not only the cave, we don't know how big it was, how many people you could bury in it, but he also owned the plot, the land, the field. We don't know how big it was, but that's a future burial plot for his descendants. Sarah would be the first of many who would be buried here in the cave and also in the field. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Leah, and Rachel were all buried in the cave. We learn that Joseph is going to be brought back to the same general area after his bones are buried in Egypt and then dug up by Moses and carried about for the entirety of the wilderness wandering. And then they're going to be buried back in this general area. So these were buried in their own land that Abraham bought for 400 shekels of silver, even though the nation of Israel would not fully possess this land for several hundreds of years later. So again, this speaks prophetically of partial ownership in this field as a down payment of a full future ownership by Abraham's descendants according to the promises of God. The land was their own, yet the land was not fully theirs, and the land was not their true home. They were sojourners in a land not their own, as the patriarchs were, just as we are today. And so we, like the patriarchs, are sojourners. We forget that, don't we? We are awaiting our future and our final destination, our homegoing with the Lord. So we consider ourselves Americans, but really we're Christians. We consider ourselves Pennsylvanians, but really we're the children of God. We call the place we live in our home, but it is really just a temporary dwelling place as we await the completion of our adoption and go home to be with the Lord for eternity. This is why Jesus told his disciples on the eve that he was to be betrayed in John 14, "Do not let your heart be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." We get so trapped by our belonging to this local, this regional, this national place that we often forget that this is all temporary. Although you're paying a mortgage, or although you've paid off a mortgage, that is not your true home. One day, that place you've invested so much time and energy and effort into, it's going to dissolve. It's going to disappear. But our true dwelling place in the heavenlies with God our Father in His home will last for eternity. We will be with Him. We will be where Jesus is, and He's going to come and take us to where He is according to His promises, which are appropriated to our lives by our faith in the finished work of Jesus Christ. Our future homegoing is secured through our faith. Our faith in God is a gift of grace, allowing us to know the truth about who God is. And because of that, we are able to claim all the promises of God, right? All the promises of God in Jesus are yes. Our claim to the promises that were made a yes in Jesus are ours through faith, by grace, in the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. No one and nothing can ever take that away. What we're seeing in the life of Abraham foreshadows a reality that we can understand today, that the patriarchs and even the vast majority of Judaism cannot piece together. He is an example, a sojourner in a land not his own, just as we are today. He awaited his homegoing by faith, just as we do today. And we do so because of the grace of God. Would you join me in prayer, please?